Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and we are continuing our tribute to the late, great, independent producer and director, Roger Corman, with one of the most artistically interesting films in his Edgar Allan Poe cycle. From 1964, it is The Masque of the Red Death, starring the gorgeous Hazel Court, Patrick Magee, and of course, the master of menace, Vincent Price, as the wicked Prince Prospero. Joining us tonight is prolific author and film historian. He is the author of the book English Gothic, A Century of Horror Cinema, Mr. Jonathan Rigby. How are you doing tonight, Jonathan?
I'm doing very well, Ryan. Thanks very much.
Now, Roger Corman, I do think it's perhaps not unfortunate, but he does seem to be best known as, let's say, a frugal producer of what we would call exploitation films. But I personally don't think he gets enough credit as an actual director.
No, indeed he doesn't. It was a little dispiriting when he died just a few weeks ago to see so many obituaries titled, just King of the B movies and, kind of dismissing him in that way. I mean, he had a rather technical industry-based definition of what a B movie was. So as far as he was concerned, he didn't even make B movies. So, but that's another matter. But nevertheless, the fact that, he was just... And of course, he was also hailed as an enabler of all sorts of younger filmmakers who've since come along, some very big names, of course. But some of those obituaries did seem a little snooty. But I think where horror films are concerned, we get used to this. I'm afraid it's still there, that snootiness. But yes, no, I mean the Poe films in particular. He brought a very interesting new sort of palette in a way to the horror film. Obviously, the Gothic films made by Hammer in England had been enormously successful, and American International Pictures went along with Corman's suggestion to make one relatively big, expensive movie for the price of the sort of twofers that they used to do. And so they made House of Usher in 1960, a big smash. It was Corman's first Poe movie, and of course he brought the sort of thing that Corman brought to the table, I think, was he brought a certain amount of psychedelia to the table, actually. It's sort of proto-psychedelia. You only have to look at some of those credit sequences of his early Poe films to realise that. And also a certain psychological acuity, I mean, he'd actually, studied in that area, and he'd also, in the interests of being a good actor's director as well as anything else, he'd also done acting classes, I think involving some of those protégés of his, names like Jack Nicholson and all the rest of it. So he was a young and very imaginative director, at this point in the early 60s, and him and Edgar Allan Poe, and of course Vincent Price, proved a perfect match. And these films, they're of their time, and yet they still stand up, which I think is an interesting sort of double achievement, really. They made a huge impact. In fact, they raised American International's sights considerably. Suddenly, American International, became quite ambitious and became a bigger company with bigger ambitions. And all that really is down to Corman.
Certainly. Now, The Masque of the Red Death is an interesting entry in this series because it's my understanding this was the first time Roger Corman decided to shoot in the UK as opposed to Hollywood. Why was that?
I think he was very aware by the end of 1963 when this film was shot, he was very aware that the Poe series, there was a danger of the Poe series becoming a bit repetitive in terms of its effects. After all, they tended to be based on really rather short stories, and so they often needed quite a lot of padding. And he was aware that sometimes the padding was beginning to look a bit similar from film to film. So how to invigorate them? First of all, he made a comedy in 1962, The Raven, a sort of Poe-esque comedy. Then he made Easter 63, thereabouts, a film that was actually more based on H.P. Lovecraft than Poe, The Haunted Palace, marvellous film. But to give the Poe series yet another shot in the arm, I think he felt that going to the UK would be beneficial and give the series a sort of fillip. And of course, AIP had an existing relationship with Anglo Amalgamated. And of course, making the films in Britain was economically useful as well. And so the last two Corman Poe films, The Masque of the Red Death, followed by The Tomb of Ligier, were were effectively British films. Obviously, they were American-British co-productions, but shot in Britain. And I do think that they did give the Poe series a bit of a different flavour. I was watching The Masque of the Red Death just a little earlier today, actually, and I was thinking this film doesn't feel quite the same as those other Poe films. It has the same controlling hand, but it has it's made in a big British studio, Elstree, and it's got British actors and British technicians working on it, including, by the way, the cinematographer Nicholas Roeg, who is going to become a very big name as a director subsequently, and you can trace the wonderful colour effects in Masque of the Red Death to him. And so the film has a different flavour. It's more expansive. It's certainly, as Corman himself said, the most lavish, the most expansive of the Poe films. And really, the subject demanded that. I think he'd first thought of doing The Masque of the Red Death in, I think, February '61. But he was aware that at that stage, AIP, as it was constituted in Hollywood at that time, really couldn't embrace such a big subject, set in the 12th century, and there are scores of extras and lots of just plain actors. I mean, his first Corman film, House of Usher, only had 4, properly speaking. It's very different to The Masque of the Red Death. So over he came to the UK, sort of freshly invigorated, I think, by the fact that he was working at Elstree. And the film started shooting on the 18th of November 1963. For all the American personnel, including Vincent Price, of course, it was terrible for everybody, but on the 5th day of production, Friday the 22nd of November, they hear about President John F. Kennedy being assassinated. So that was quite a thing to happen when you're an American over in England. And suddenly this thing happens back in your homeland. And that shattered the whole cast and crew for a while, of course.
Well, I was going to say, that certainly adds another layer watching this film on 35 millimeter in the Texas theater, the very same theater where Lee Harvey Oswald was apprehended.
Ah, well, there is a connection to the Kennedy assassination in this very film.
Yes.
But and so anyway, he raced ahead in his usual, economical way. Corman raced ahead and had the film finished by Christmas. He later lamented that he'd actually, he always liked to save pennies where he could, or cents rather. So there were extra mandated union fees would have been required just before Christmas time to go into overtime. And he felt that if he'd actually agreed to pay those fees, he could have made the final mask sequence a really massive and impressive spectacle rather than just the merely good sequence, as he called it, that it turned out to be. Tell you what, it's more than a merely good sequence. I think watching it again, I was really struck by how marvellous the last 20 minutes of the film are. The Poe story is really a kind of very bleak, allegorical statement about the inevitability of death. It's as simple as that. Not a lot happens in it. But that final sequence of Corman's, despite the fact that he thought it wasn't big enough, that final sequence really, I think, gets that Poe quality, that despairing quality about, death will come to us all, and being a Poe story, of course, generally speaking, a highly unpleasant death will come to us all. Apropos of which, it's quite interesting that this particular film and story gained new traction a few years ago when COVID came along, and of course various national governments imposed lockdowns of one sort or another. We had particularly stringent ones here in the UK. I'm not sure about you in the US.
Well, we're in Texas. Texas didn't quite agree with a lot of those lockdowns.
That's right.
So we didn't feel it.
Well, in Britain in particular, there was a lot of talk about the Masque of the Red Death in 2020, because, of course, the story is about a terrible plague that is laying waste the countryside, and the conceited, and in the film at any rate, explicitly Satanist Prince Prospero gathers all his like-minded nobles, and they shut themselves away in his castle. They become literally castellated. They kind of impose their own lockdown. But of course, the Red Death, I don't think I'm giving much away to say that the Red Death gets in. That's kind of a given. And so that final 20 minutes, I think, is a marvelous piece of semi-operatic cinema. It really affected me again, seeing it. I've seen this film many times over the years, but I think that whole last reel or two is magnificent.
So, Jonathan, for the people in our audience who have never seen one of these Roger Corman Poe films, what do they have to look forward to?
Well, they have to look forward to Vincent Price for a start. There was a trade paper over here in the UK which had a very nice line about him playing Prince Prospero in this film. It said, with that striking Gothic face of his, and air of supercilious fanaticism, Vincent Price is ideally cast. This is one of his, I think this is one of his benchmark performances, really. You get Vincent Price distilled into this one medieval sadist, and boy, he's a sadist. He's a very philosophical sadist. There's quite a lot of chat in this film. It was written by two very expert writers, Charles Beaumont and R. Wright Campbell. There's a lot of chat, and a lot of it is borne by Price and Jane Asher, the young Jane Asher, whose boyfriend at the time, by the way, was Paul McCartney, and he came to visit the set because he said, I've never seen a film set before, can I come along? And he did. And of course, just the following year, he saw plenty of film sets because he made Hard Day's Night with the Beatles, didn't he? So,
Are there stills of that? Are there images of Paul McCartney?
I've not, but Corman and McCartney met on the set, and Corman, being an American who'd just come over to the UK, didn't have the slightest idea that the Beatles were already pretty gigantic in the UK, and he felt he was just meeting this young guy from Liverpool. Anyway, so yes, you've got Vincent Price. You've got the sort of opposite pole, the sort of female leads are opposite poles, both redheads, which is an interesting choice. Hazel Court, who was something of a horror veteran at this time, and the very young Jane Asher. As you mentioned, you've got Patrick Magee, very sepulchral Irish actor. You've got wonderful colour effects from Nicholas Roeg. You've got Corman's usual production designer, Daniel Haller, who was let loose in Elstree, and he noticed that Peter Glenville's film of Beckett had just finished. That was the film with Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton, of course, set in medieval times. So look at all these bits and pieces of sets that we can cannibalize and put together to create, as Corman put it, the most lavish-looking Poe film of them all. As I say, you've got quite a lot of philosophical chat. You've got quite a number of other totemic actors of the period, like Nigel Green, who plays the sort of peasant boy's father. It's a very tense sequence there where the boy and his father are pitted against each other in a sort of... There are two such sequences. And then, as I say, the whole thing builds up to this remarkable mask sequence. There are quite a few balls held in horror films of the period. You know, Hammer had just done The Kiss of the Vampire, which has a marvellous ball sequence. And a few years later, Polanski is going to do Dance of the Vampires, which you know in America as The Fearless Vampire Killers, which again has a magnificent ball sequence. And here, of course, we have the original horror mask sequence in The Masque of the Red Death. And as I say, the final couple of reels are very, very, very powerful. And I think they do distill, you know, the essence of Poe really in a very interesting way. I think that's the film's real achievement. It's building to this climactic sequence. Tied in, by the way, I better mention this, tied into that climactic sequence is another Edgar Allan Poe story. Because, of course, as I said, Poe's stories tended to be not just short, but actually very often very short. And so they needed a bit of ballast if you're going to make a feature film out of them. And so Campbell and Beaumont, the screenwriters, took a story called Hop Frog, which again is a sort of medieval, sort of nasty little story in which a small person who's been abused at court by a nasty sadistic man gets his revenge, and you'll see how that's sort of knitted into The Masque of the Red Death when you watch the film.
Well, Mr. Jonathan Rigby, once again, thank you so much for your time.
I've gone on and on, haven't I? But there, it's a film that's well worth your time.
Without further ado, from 1964, director Roger Corman's The Masque of the Red Death. That really is a powerful film, especially seeing it in its full scope Technicolor glory.
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, Corman, and this is one of the films that this is one of the features of Corman's approach that distinguished him, by and large, from Hammer films. He was very keen on the scope, the wide scope frame, which Hammer films occasionally use, but not very often. But Corman made it a point to make his films in scope. And they do have this expansive, literally expansive quality, particularly this one. It's I like, it's interesting that I think the Poe story ends with the most shattering line in all horror literature. What is it? And darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. And marvelously, they actually quote that on screen right at the end. And that brings you into, I don't think we should omit to mention this, that brings you into wonderful animated outro credit sequence, which, a lot of people will be in cinemas back in 1964. A lot of people will have been getting up and fetching their coats and thinking, oh my God, look at this. The animated sequence with that hideously creepy hand dealing all those tarot cards, and he deals all the hand, maybe a female hand, the hand deals 12 cards, and oh my God, the 13th card, and of course the 13th card is the death card. And I think that ending is shattering. And David Lee's music, David Lee's score, I think, is one of the weaker features of the film for quite a bit of the film. But for the ball sequence and then for that final credit sequence, it's shattering, and that animation sequence is marvelous. But also, of course, you get the tragedy and despair of human existence expressed marvelously when the Red Death says to Prospero right at the end, "Why should you be afraid to die? Your soul has been dead for a long time." And then casts his red mantle over him, and of course he starts suppurating with that awful red juice or whatever it is that indicates disease. It's a marvelous ending, and the way Price, in that slightly operatic way of Price, I say slightly, considerably operatic way that Price had of kind of fighting his way through all the dancers in his black sheikh's uniform and his black leather trousers. I noticed watching it again, and all the British extras and guest artists covered in blood are kind of doing some lovely sort of kind of specially choreographed dancing, and then they eventually all expire at his feet and he's the only one left. I mean, I think that's really, as I pointed out before, Corman was disappointed by that sequence, but I can't imagine why. It's marvelous. And so in the best kind of slightly simplistic way, it's extremely profound. I think it sort of strikes at a kind of profundity, a kind of Poe-esque profundity, and that's really all that Corman was required to do, wasn't it? And he succeeded.
When you have film series, especially something like this, which of course the Poe cycle was never intended to be a series, right? Each movie would make more money, so you have to do another one. Yeah. Did Mask of the Red Death experience diminishing returns at the box office? Because of course Tomb of Ligeia would be the final installment.
So I don't think it did. No, I don't think it did. I think the critical response to Corman's Poe films ratcheted up as they went along, particularly in Britain. British critics were very suspicious of anything that was actually British, so they tended to hate Hammer films. And so when they encountered a young and exciting director from America who'd heard of Sigmund Freud, amongst other things, and was aware of, psychodelia was sort of coming up from under, and they were thrilled to bits to fall on Roger Corman. They used him rather as a stick to beat Hammer with. But nevertheless, with The Mask of the Red Death, I think he was reaching the zenith of this kind of critical adulation. And then, and Tomb of Ligeia was also very much, kind of very well reviewed by and large. But I think really the trouble was Corman was getting bored by that stage. He'd rung the changes in various ways, and finally he'd gone to the UK to make, British co-productions, which gave the Poe films a new flavour. But I think having done that, I think he thought we better draw these films to a close. Now, of course, that wasn't to AIP's. AIP weren't very happy about that, so they made a whole bunch of other films with increasingly scant relation to Edgar Allan Poe, but they nevertheless advertise them as such. But Corman was no longer involved. I think really what brought the series to an end, as far as Corman was concerned, was the fact that he felt he'd said all he could say, and that's a
Right.
very good artistic decision. Get out while you're still ahead, and he
Sure.
did. And he did.
And a lot of these Poe stories, and I owe it less to Poe and more, the screenwriters who are adapting them for the same screen, who are adapting them for the big screen. You have a lot of, so it's very much the same formula, the structure. Like if you watch Pit and the Pendulum back to back with The Fall of the House of Usher, they're structurally very similar films. So you're kind of playing around with the same formula. And I mean, Mask of Red Death certainly stands out among the pack, but I can understand his. Uh, Perhaps his exhaustion with the formula at that point.
Well, it still has. I mean, until that final 20-minute section, which is magnificent, it does rather show signs. I mean, it's not a problem necessarily, but it does rather show signs of the problem that all the Poe films had, which was that they had to flesh out the story. And so you do get quite a lot of Jane Asher wandering the corridors, and that was one of the big features of the earlier Poe films, was an awful lot of corridor wandering, generally while holding a little candelabra or something. So there's a lot of that, and there's a lot of byplay in the dungeons, isn't there? And so the film sort of proceeds in bits and in sort of fits and starts in a way, because there's lots of features that they've bolted on to the basic story. Then, of course, at the end, it can finally just take the basic story and run with it, and that's when it becomes magnificent. So I think those problems are still kind of there in The Mask of the Red Death. But that was one of Corman's worries about the Poe films, because, of course, there is always the problem of repetition. And
Right.
the thing that really disguised the repetition with Mask of the Red Death was the fact that he went to Britain and made a much bigger film.
Certainly, and I think what makes the film work, and why I think that's a benefit to the production, is I love all these British character actors in these smaller roles. So it has a much stronger supporting cast than some of the American extras and smaller parts in the earlier Poe films.
Well, I hope nobody will take this amiss, but I do think some of his earlier Poe films were a little bit hamstrung by the fact that Vincent Price was the only actor who got it. By which I mean he was the only actor who really understood the métier, who really understood the sort of Gothic mode. The sort of youngish act. I said that Corman actually took acting lessons with all those guys like Jack Nicholson and people like that. But a lot of those young actors who were very influenced by Lee Strasberg and the rest of it, weird Gothic stuff set in the distant past it was just an alien world to them. Whereas, for whatever reason, British actors, rather like Vincent Price himself, just could tap into that more convincingly, I think. I hope that's not a sort of nationalistic thing to say, but that's the impression I get. I mean, sometimes the supporting actors in the American Corman Poe films just don't seem to quite get it. But when Vincent Price arrived in the UK, I think he was surrounded by actors who were more like him, really. And it's an interesting point that when he came to the UK to make The Mask of the Red Death in late '63, where horror films are concerned, and he did mainly make horror films, he would not make another non-British horror film for 23 years. In April '86, I think it was, he spends 2 days on a film called From a Whisper to a Scream, which was a portmanteau film. And that was the first horror film he'd made in America, and which was a purely American film, ever since The Mask of the Red Death. Everything he'd done in the interim had been British, which is interesting. He felt very much at home in British studios. Who knows why? But it was a wonderful marriage, because of course some great movies flowed from that.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to think he spent all that time in the United Kingdom. And I've heard different rumors. I've heard it was contractual issues. It was a rivalry. He spent all that time making horror films in the UK. He never made a movie for Hammer.
No, he didn't.
Why was that? I mean, what's the real story, if you happen to know?
Well, Hammer never approached him, as far as I know. I think they didn't want to. AIP were positioned very much in the US as Hammer were in Britain. And indeed, AIP set up a British company of their own called AIP England, and it was that company, strictly speaking, that made films like Witchfinder General, marvelous Vincent Price films like that. So AIP were encroaching on Hammer, not just sort of in the minds of horror fans, but also in the UK itself. But Hammer didn't want to encroach on AIP's preserves, and as far as I'm aware, they never asked Vincent Price. There was a contractual thing going on between Vincent Price and AIP, and by the late 60s, he was getting increasingly cheesed off by it. He was really quite irritated by the end of the 60s.
Really?
He was a great, rather like Prince Prospero, of course. Vincent Price was quite the aesthete. He was very much a Renaissance man. He was very much an aesthete, and I think with AIP he was aware that he was dealing with people that, in his estimation anyway, were not aesthetes, and the sort of business-led model became increasingly annoying to him. I think that's a fairly standard thing.
Sure. I mean, it should be. Oh, sorry. Go on.
No, you go on. That's fine.
No, well, I was curious too. So, I mean, AIP eventually did have a relationship with Hammer. I believe they co-produced The Vampire Lovers.
Yes, they did. That's right. Yeah. AIP. That was the one official kind of collaboration. But otherwise, they kind of sort of stood apart from each other, and probably in a kind of, from a standpoint of mutual respect, but perhaps a little bit of caution as well. But yes, there was The Vampire Lovers, where they did literally co-produce a film, and from anecdotal evidence, you get the impression that the methods of AIP and the methods of Hammer did not mesh. But that's another story.
Sure.
The Mask of the Red Death was a very early stage. The Mask of the Red Death, I think I'm right in saying, was the first film that AIP made in Britain. That because they'd been involved with Anglo Amalgamated, AIP had also been involved in a bunch of British horror films like Catgirl and Horrors of the Black Museum, I think, and Circus of Horrors and Night of the Eagle, which is known as Burn Witch Burn in the US. But the first film they sort of officially made in the UK was, as far as I remember, The Mask of the Red Death. So it was very early in the game. And Hammer probably was sort of pussyfooting around them quite cautiously. And The Mask of the Red Death is certainly not a film you'd expect Hammer to make, and indeed, and they didn't make it, nor did they make anything that resembled it. There are a few interesting features of The Mask of the Red Death. Did you notice Juliana, who's played by Hazel Court, who, as well as being a feature in the Corman Poe films, of course, had also featured before that in some Hammer films, including the first big Gothic Hammer film, The Curse of Frankenstein. Hazel Court, did you notice that she's pecked to death by a raven? I think it's that raven, isn't it, that pecks her to death? There's a falcon in the film too, but I think it's the raven that pecks her to death. It's interesting that the film was made at the end of 1963 because a big movie released earlier in 1963 was The Birds.
That's right, yeah.
That famous attic scene in which Tippi Hedren is assaulted by massed seagulls and what have you. And you think, I think we know what Corman's tapping into there, maybe. Yeah, a little bit of a Hitchcock quote there. So actually, it's a very gruesome sequence for the time. The one aspect of the film that I don't much care for, really, is I mentioned that the Poe story Hop Frog is incorporated. I have no objection to Hop Frog, but they had the Esmeralda character, who's the another small person who is Hop Frog's, or Hop Toad as he's called in the film for some reason. Skip Martin plays Hop Toad, and he has his lady love. We're presumably meant to think is this person called Esmeralda, who's another small person. And Corman cast a little girl, Verena Greenlaw, who was 7 at the time, and she was. I did some research into Verena Greenlaw. She was actually a genius. There were lots of British newspaper reports about this was a little girl. Even when she was only 5, she could already speak French and Italian, and she'd amazed the education authorities with her staggering intelligence. But she was also appearing in films. And so, because he presumably couldn't find a little person who could feasibly be Hop Toad's lady love, who could also do the ballet dancing and all the rest. He cast a 7-year-old girl and had an adult voice dubbed on. And so when Alfredo and Prospero are looking at Esmeralda with frankly prurient eyes, I mean, I know that these aristocrats are meant to be hideous and
Right.
and all the rest of it, hideous sybaritic monsters and all the rest of it, but there's a big whiff of paedophilia there. I mean, what else can there be? And on that particular score, I do think, what was Corman thinking? Why did he cast a 7-year-old? Because that makes Hot Toad also a bit suspect. In that
Right.
regard. I mean, I don't know if you want to feature this because it's an unfortunate feature of the film. But from the time I first saw it when I was a boy, I thought, that's a little girl of 7. What?
Well, I think, I mean, it certainly does.
Dear.
Well, I think it certainly highlights, like you said, the debauched nature of the court. So, yeah, it is weird that he would get away with
in
that.
that way, though. I don't think it was meant.
Right.
It's very hard. I mean, yeah, Alfredo is. I mean, yes, I suppose you could say if you're being vengeful and looking at it as a horror parable, then he deserves to be burned as a gorilla attached to a chandelier. But it's a misstep, shall we put it that way? I've never been able to get my head around that quite in the film. But anyway,
Sure. Well,
that is an unusual misstep in the film. There's a lot to like. There's a lot to like in the film.
absolutely. So, where do you rank The Masque of the Red Death amongst Poe adaptations? And do you have a favorite Corman Poe film?
I think I rank it very high among Poe adaptations. There've been so many Poe adaptations, and
Oh, sure.
and I think I'd rank The Masque of the Red Death very high, if only because, as I said earlier, in that last 20 minutes, it really does get to the sort of the core of Poe. I think that very morbid, despairing, philosophical thing. I think it does that very successfully. My favourite Corman Poe, oddly enough, is I think I mentioned this one earlier too, is the one that's actually really an H.P. Lovecraft film. I think
The Haunted Palace.
The Haunted Palace is a marvelous film, and Price again is marvelous in it. But they all have something of value. I mean, House of Usher, set the template for them, and they're all very. I'm going to be heretical and say the one I like the least is The Raven. I know there are lots of people who love The Raven, but the attempts at comedy, I don't think a comedy was Corman's thing, to be honest. And I think, I don't care for The Raven, I'm afraid to say. But
I do I like Tales of Terror. I'm a big fan of the Black Cat, the Cask of Amontillado sequence. I thought that was kind of funny.
That was a semi-comic sequence which actually made him think, well, I tell you what, let's make a whole feature, which is comic, and hence The Raven. But the Tales of Terror has some great stuff in it. I particularly like the story with Basil Rathbone, which is based on Monsieur Valdemar. I think The Masque of the Red Death is pretty high among Poe adaptations, and as I say, that those final couple of reels are one of Corman's greatest achievements. I think.
You know what?
I'd rate it that highly. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you reminded me of a quote. I believe it was Roger Corman who said this once in an interview, that Edgar Allan Poe didn't craft narrative stories. He wrote really compelling climaxes. So when he was adapting these stories like Pit and the Pendulum, The Masque of the Red Death, you really have an amazing climax of the story, but you have to reverse engineer the first hour and 20 minutes to get to that point.
Yes, who said that? I know Richard Matheson, the screenwriter, said
Perhaps
that.
It was Richard Matheson. I thought it was Roger Corman who said it in an interview.
Oh, well, I'm sure he said it too, because that was the basic problem. He gave you this sort of kernel of a marvelous, generally speaking, yes, the climax, and you have to find a way of getting there. And particularly The Masque of the Red Death. I mean, it's only 5 pages long.
Right.
It's not a story like The Black Cat, which actually does have some conventional narrative about a maniac who conceives an irrational antipathy for a cat and then accidentally kills his wife with an axe. It doesn't have any of that. It's literally just about Prince Prospero lording it over his fellow nobles in a castle, and then the Red Death breaks in.
But Roger Corman made it work.
Roger Corman and Charles Beaumont and R. Wright Campbell, the screenwriters, made it work, and so too did, I think, it was a bit of a shot in the arm for him going to the UK, I think. I mean, for instance, oddly enough, the film reminds me a bit of a film Corman did in the summer of '56. He did a film called The Undead, in which a contemporary prostitute is hypnotized and relives a sort of medieval past life. And so there we are, you've got Corman doing medieval. And there he was shooting in a disused supermarket on Sunset Boulevard. With The Masque of the Red Death, he's got Elstree at his disposal. In fact, when the film started shooting, Elstree was occupied only by The Saint, that famous television series with Roger Moore of the period. The only thing at Elstree, other than The Masque of the Red Death, was The Saint. So suddenly, Corman, he's no longer in a disused supermarket on Sunset Boulevard. He's got Elstree Studios at his disposal. And I think, that really gave him, as I say, a shot in the arm, which is why The Masque of the Red Death is held by many to be the best of the Corman Poe films.
Certainly. Well, Jonathan, do you have any closing thoughts on the film?
Not really. I mean, one could talk about it for a long time. There's a particularly effective... Well, one of the saddest things about the film, in a way, is that one of the best sequences in it, and again, it's a means of padding the film out before you get to the climax, but you've got the Juliana character who betroths herself to Satan by branding one of her own breasts. And of course, this branding has a hallucinogenic effect, and you get that incredible sequence where she's ritually sacrificed by 4 different bizarre visitants. And David Lee's score goes all very Stravinsky, the Rite of Spring, at that point, and it's a classic Corman. This is another thing that distinguished Corman from Hammer films. Hammer films very rarely did dream sequences. Occasionally they did, but very rarely. It wasn't their thing. Corman, of course, with his interest in psychology and all the rest of it, was mad for dream sequences. And so you get Juliana's nightmare, it's a nightmare, of course, nightmare sequence. And that's really striking. But and this is the sad bit, at this stage in 1964, the British Board of Film Censors were having no truck with anything explicitly to do with Satanism. I mean, there's a lot of references to Satanism in the film, but a whole section, which appeared to be a kind of Satanist's dream nightmare, was too rich for their blood, and they cut it.
Which is unfortunate.
Which is highly unfortunate. British audiences, as far as I know, didn't see that sequence for a long time. They cut the damn thing. Oh, dear. Anyway.
Well, obviously this film has resonated with you personally. Do you remember the first time you saw it, and do you remember if it was the censored version or if it was the uncut film?
Well, that's a question of which version did they show on British television in the 1970s, because that's when I will have first seen it. I suspect by that stage, the British Board of Film Censors had nothing to do with television transmissions, so I suspect it was the full version. I'd have to ask around for that. I honestly don't know. I know I was very struck by it, and I know I keep talking about the last 20 minutes of the film, but I was very struck by those last 20 minutes way back then, just as I was this afternoon when I watched the film again. I think it's very. I think Poe. I already quoted the line. Poe ended the story on one of the most shattering lines in the genre, and I think the fact that Corman ends the story with the most explicit quote, really, from Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, where all the deaths assemble. That's one of the reasons he delayed making Masque of the Red Death, he said, was because he knew it was bound to resemble The Seventh Seal to some degree, and he didn't want invidious comparisons. Of course, he got them anyway. Inevitably, just because he waited a few years, he still got comparisons to The Seventh Seal, obviously. But nonetheless, it's a very haunting scene. And then, you get that final animated end title sequence, which I think is and I think that is one of the greatest in the genre where films are concerned. So you've got Poe's classic closing line, and Corman balances it with, first of all, with a sequence that recalls the Seventh Seal, and then with this wonderful animated sequence, which is one of the greatest in the genre, I think. That's
Absolutely.
it. That's it. That's
Sure.
the Mask of the Red Death. It's we could talk about it for hours, but we shan't because people would fall
Oh,
asleep.
of course. So, Jonathan, if there's anyone watching this conversation or watching the series for the first time, what are you working on right now that you want the audience to know about?
At the moment, I'm working on a book which has been taking me a long time. It's called American Gothic 2 at the moment. And this is because I previously wrote a book called American Gothic. What else? So American Gothic 2 actually deals with the Poe films because that's the sort of beginning of the story in 1960. And it goes right up to the mid-80s. It may not seem like a very long time, but it's a gigantic field because America was making an awful lot of horror films in that quarter century period.
It is interesting if you're tackling the Gothic subject matter, maybe you're waiting for a volume three, but I feel like the 1990s had an interesting revival with movies like Coppola's Dracula, Sleepy Hollow, even the Mummy films, or I mean, kind of tie into
Well,
that
no, yeah,
tradition.
no, indeed, that's absolutely right. But I have to think of two. Why am I closing it in 1985? Well, I have to think of two things. The book has to be a feasible length,
Of course, yeah.
and also I have to try to retain my sanity because
Yeah.
because it's a gigantic enough subject, even just going up to 1985. That's my excuse anyway.
Oh,
That's what
sure.
I'm currently working on.
Do you have any commentaries coming out? Anything on disc that we can look forward to?
Oh, yes. Kevin Lyons, I do commentaries with on a regular basis, and we did one recently. We mentioned Roger Moore earlier, and straight after doing The Saint, he did a film called The Man Who Haunted Himself.
Yes, I'm a big fan of that one.
Yeah. Oh, you're a big fan of that one. Yeah,
Yes, yeah, yeah.
we did the commentary on that, and we enjoyed that very much. It's actually that's way back when I wrote English Gothic. I was a bit rude about that film in English Gothic, but one's tastes change and one's opinions change. And watching it again, I really liked it. And so yes, we did
Mhm.
that, for example. But they sort of flow along quite nicely. But that might be one to look out for because that's a very interesting
Sure. I have the Kino Blu-ray, but you're making me want to double dip. So,
film. Again, a film made at Elstree, of course. So.
yeah. Well, Jonathan Rigby, once again, thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a
Of
pleasure to
course.
talk, and again, as always on these occasions, it's a pleasure to watch the film again.
Yes.
I get this little prod from you, and I think, oh, go on, the Mask of the Red, and then, oh gosh, I'm enjoying this. I thought I'd seen them. You think you've seen a film multiple times, that's enough, but then you watch it again, and again, it draws you in, and you're fascinated. So, and it's all your fault.
If you're in the audience, I hope you enjoyed the film as much as we did. Once again, I'm Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.